All right. So thank you everybody for joining me. And I'm just chatting a little bit about the other side, journeys into mysticism, magic, and near death. I'm holding it up so you can see the cover. And I want to talk about why covers are so important and how this cover was chosen. But first, the book came out in early September, and it's really been an absolute whirlwind of a launch. I've done talk after talk, festival after festival, podcast after podcast, radio show after radio show. And I had a little bit of a rolling eye moment today when I was telling somebody that I have done two radio/podcast interviews a day, and each of them has been an hour long. And I say that because it's a long time, an hour, right? But apparently that this is the way podcasting goes. In fact, I was told by one podcaster interview that that was a short interview and that some people like to do a 3-hour interview. So I don't know if any of you listen to long podcasts like that. I don't, but it seems to be the way podcasting is going. So this is also streaming on YouTube and it's being streamed by my publisher. So I just want to talk about the other side in the book. So the first thing I want to remind people is that this is not my first book. In fact, my book writing journey began in 2005 when I was actually commissioned. Luckily, I was luckily commissioned by a publisher to write a book. And that happened because I was already a journalist. I was a humor journalist. I was a columnist. And they said to me, Sarah, there's a fantastic, really funny book about parenting in Australia. We don't have one locally. Can you write one and localize it? And of course, I was confident. I was 28. I just had a baby. I was deep in the indignities of it. And I said, absolutely. I wrote them a 2-page book proposal. And that book became my first book, Hey Baby, The Hip New Mom's Guide. That's all about you, which was remarkably and unexpectedly a bestseller. And my book journey began then. I'd been in the world of magazines and suddenly I moved into the world of books, not just writing books, but working with authors, editing novels, running romance writing courses. And the second book came out 2 years later called Romance 101, How Your Relationships Can Survive Your Kids and Other Passion Killers. So book number 2 happened, and at that point I was 32. I had 2 young children. And what I didn't know that there was a passion killer in a relationship that I'd never expected. And that passion killer was cancer. And that came to meet my husband. So my husband, he was a young filmmaker and he was diagnosed with an unexpected brain tumor. He was 37 at the time, just celebrating his 38th birthday party. I was 32. And that tumor spiraled my entire small family into a very unexpected and strange world, the world of cancer, the world of a seek for a cure, and at the same time, an even more strange and unusual world because my husband was at the time studying to become a sangoma, which is also known as a shaman in other countries. So he not only took the medical route and had the brain surgery and went for chemo and radiation, but he also pursued a very strange and unusual path using ancestral work, medicine, ritual, and ceremony to work with his cancer. But the beginning of my story and the beginning of the near-death experience journey that I'm going to talk about happened 4 years into his brain cancer. So 4 years he'd been fighting this. We'd been on the strange and mystical journey already. I was 36 at the time. My children were 7 and 9. I was running the show, running a house, making the money, as we do, being a functional human as my husband was dying in the sidelines. And what happened was an extraordinary and unexpected journey. I got a little chest cold, tickle in my throat. And within 24 hours, what was initially diagnosed as influenza, blew up into an unspecified illness. And I was rushed into hospital. I was moved into ICU and I was put on life support in an induced coma. An induced coma was to last close to a month. 3 weeks I was in a coma. And during that time, my husband himself was in the last month of his life and was slipping in and out of a coma down the road. So something very strange and otherworldly was already happening. He was in a coma. I was in a coma, completely unexpectedly and randomly. His coma was one that he wouldn't come out of. My coma was one I was to come out of. But during the time that I was in this space, I went on what is an extended near-death experience, in which I traveled into other worlds and other realms. And very briefly, I'm going to tell you what those were. And I say briefly because it's quite clearly laid out in The Other Side, which is the new book I'm launching. But more than that, it's in my previous book called Love and Above, A Journey Through Shamanism, Coma, and Joy. But what did happen while my body, my 36-year-old body, was lying intubated on life support on a bed with my family around me, with people sending love, prayers, Facebook groups going, was my soul or spirit had left my body and started traveling further and further away. And I really do detail in the book the different levels of this near-death experience I went on, because it was quite an extended one. And I begin in what I call the world of nightmares, which was very similar to what's called ICU psychosis. So it's very nightmarish visions. It's feelings of invasion. It was a constant repetitious dream of dying and dying and dying. But that ended. And what happened is I started to move further and further away from my body. Initially, I just moved around what I still call Earth. I could see recognizable figures. I could see the horizon. There was, landmarks. But slowly I moved further and further away into what are other spirit planes. And it was in one of those that I was to meet up with my husband in that spirit world. And now I'm using inverted commas because for many people, this is a very strange concept. Probably not people who are going to buy the book, right? So people who are going to buy the book already potentially are seekers. They're spirit people. They're people who've got a mind, who understand that there's other things out there. So I started to move further and further away. And the first plane that was there, and it was a ritual to say goodbye. And I moved further and I moved further. And a lot of this is documented quite carefully along with the medical records of my actual experience. And I moved further and further away until ultimately I ended up in the very far reaches of the universe, what I call the universe, or the great nothingness. And in that place, there was just a huge, open, empty silence. And that's the place from which I had to come back. And what happened in my coma at that time was my family and friends from across the world gathered to do a prayer service. Did not matter their religion, their creed, their belief system, their country they lived in. They prayed for me. And I know that out there I heard the call, because my medical records start to show a turnaround and a return. I'm not going to tell you too much about the worlds I traveled into, because so much of that is in the book. But what I am going to say is my experience of having a near-death experience and traveling into the soul journey wasn't quite what I expected. It wasn't potentially what we read about. I didn't see a light. I didn't go through a tunnel. I didn't speak to God. There were not angels. There were other things there. There were other beings and otherworldly things. But when I woke up from that coma, a book was on everybody's lips that year. The year was 2012, and the book was Proof of Heaven by Dr. Ibn Alexander. Now, I don't know how many of you know about this or have read it, but Dr. Ibn Alexander was a neurosurgeon, and he was in a 7-day coma with encephalitis, and he woke up from it and had a near-death experience similar to mine. And he wrote all about it. And everybody said to me, when I came out of hospital and I fought my way out of the coma, I was very ill. I was learning to walk again, to talk again. I was grieving the loss of my husband, who had passed away at that time. People have said to me, have you read Proof of Heaven? Did anything like that happen to you? What was it like being in a coma? Did you know people were by your bed next to you? Well, I didn't, is the first answer. I didn't know that I was a mother. I didn't know that I had children. I had no awareness of the body lying in the bed. I was simply a soul on a journey searching for something. And I hadn't read Proof of Heaven. And the reason I hadn't read it and I didn't want to read it was the very title of it scared me. By just the naming of what he had seen, I knew he had seen heaven, this magical, wonderful place, and I hadn't seen that. In fact, where I had been and what I had experienced was quite scary. I was aimless. I was formless. I was in the great nothingness. I was floating. I wasn't comfortable. I wasn't filled with grace. I wasn't in a place of beauty. I was in a place that was not where I was meant to be. I think that was the awareness within me. And yet there was no knowledge of how to get out of it. And so time passed, and I had lived. I was back at home. I made some radical life decisions. I'd lost my husband. I did a whole lot of things, and people said to me, "Sarah, you've got to write about this. This is the craziest thing. This is crazy what's happened. Not just the cancer journey, the shamanism, but this near-death experience you've had." But no part of me wanted to share or tell the story. And you will find out why when you read the book. This is very common in near-death experiences. And in this book, I've gathered many of them. This book is actually not my story. My story is in the little bit of the book, but I've gathered many other people who've had near-death experiences and those in Southern Africa. And a very common thread, and this is a very interesting thing, it's that nobody actually knows they've necessarily had a near-death experience. Nobody says to you when you've come, sorry, I'm letting people in as I'm talking. Nobody says to you when you've had a medical emergency, when you've been in a coma, or some of the stories in my book, for example, Glenn Douglas Haig was shot 7 times and died and woke up in the morgue. Your doctors don't actually tell you that. Right, you go into surgery, you're in life, you're in life recovery, you come round, you're in ICU, you're in a ward. Nobody says, by the way, I just want you to know that you died for 24 minutes the one night. So that doesn't happen. So what happened to me, and it was happened to so many of the others in this book and in these stories, is you have to piece together the physicality of what happened and somehow match it with this strange mystical and spiritual experience that you had. So for me, that took a long time. It took hospital records. And one of the moments in the book that I speak about, really for the first time having a ping off to what actually happened, was many months after I'd been discharged from hospital. I had already written down this incredibly weird travels I'd been in, the places I'd been to, the messages I had got. I went back to the hospital to one of my attending physicians because I still had a massive hole in my throat. I couldn't speak. And he looked at me and he went absolutely pale and he said, "Were you the girl in bed 8? The woman in bed 8?" And I had no idea because I'd been unconscious. And he walked out. My mother was in the waiting room and he said, "Was your daughter in bed 8 of the ICU?" And she nodded and he looked at me and he said, "The young lady, you should not be alive." He said, "I was called in the middle of the night. You'd pulled out your breathing apparatus. It took me 28 minutes to get to the hospital. When I got there, you were royal blue. We resuscitated you, but there was no chance you were going to live the night." And when I heard that, it was the first time I really understood what had happened to me. Whereas before, my brain hadn't computed that my body had experienced something so radical and that my soul had experienced something else, which was so beautiful and so expanded. So that happened to me. I didn't really say much about it. I went and lived my life. But you're going to hear this time and time again in this book. People who've had these strange and mystical experiences, they just don't go away. They just don't fade. In fact, the memory of them gets more and more acute and more specific and more real, unlike a dream. A dream is something that gets a bit murky, but these mystical experiences don't. And so it was only much further down the line that I spoke a little bit more about it. And this is the really funny part. And I'm coming up to how I ended up writing this particular book, which is really strange for me. I was commissioned to write this book, Love and Above, in 2020. And I thought this book was all about my husband's cancer and the shamanism. And yes, my coma was part of the book, and I really detailed it. In fact, I took the records from my near-death experience journal and I put it in the book. So the book takes you on this unbelievable journey through this crazy thing. And when I started promoting the book and when I was doing international radio and TV and podcasts and interviews, what everybody was talking about and everybody was asking me was not about my husband and his death and how I recovered and the trauma and the sadness, not at all. In fact, they were asking me, what was it? Where were you? What happened? Who were the spirit guides? Why did the forest man come to you? How did he help you back in the body? And that's when the kind of the movement started. I was invited to near-death experience conferences. I started to do talks at near-death. I was being interviewed on near-death experience podcasts. And then an awareness twigged in me, and I started researching it. Started researching not just our westernized view of what this is, this phenomenon called near death. I wanted to find out, is there other ways? Are there other cultures that experience this glimpse of death, as I'm going to call it, and come back that are very different to what I call the Western model? You know, the tunnel of light, the beatific being. So I set about to find out. And it turned out there really are. There really are. In fact, those which are really standard near-death experiences are not always the most common ones. They're certainly the ones that are the most researched. So this book began as an exploration as to, could I find other people who had had strange, shamanic, different near-death experiences? And it progressed from that. So a third of this book is a little bit about my story, and then a third is about the science of near death. What is this thing? What is this thing called near death? And because I couldn't find enough people, and I say this with deep honesty, with the integrity of a journalist, which is what I am. I got a lot of people coming to me as soon as I started a call for submissions of saying, I nearly died. I nearly died. Yes, I had a near-death experience. And all of them I had to put through a little bit of rigor. And there's a lot of rigor in this field of study. In fact, there's very specific checks and benchmarks to understand, is it near death? What scale is it on it? So I selected what I thought were really extraordinary near-death experiences. But because I found other things that were equally extraordinary, I had a second category. So you're going to find part of 2 of my book is near-death experiences, people who died and came back. I have a Kabbalic rabbi, Bullen who had 2 near-death experiences and came back to become a mystic, to become a teacher in Kabbalah. There is a Glenn Douglas Haig who was shot 7 times. He died in the ambulance and he woke up, as I said, on the way to the morgue, and lived and is still alive as a leg amputee. There's Godfrey Madlatle, who had 2 near-death experiences during his training as a medicine man, and went on to survive and heal himself through his training in this arts. There's Colleen Joy Page, who died twice on an operating table at age 4. And she speaks about that experience of this incredible beauty and this place she found that she gave the word home. She called it home because at 4 years old, that was really what the mind could attach to this place she'd been. So I've got all these crazy, beautiful, wonderful stories. And I also decided to include in the book out-of-body experiences. They are different to near death. These are the people who didn't have to clinically die to have an extraordinary mystical experience. So I've got those 2. And the third category of person I've got in this book, which was really fascinating and the most fun, honestly, to find, were the people who can communicate to the other side or with the other side without having to experience it themselves. So these are your psychics, your seers, your mystics, your sangomas, your trance dancers, your people who have trained in plant medicine, who can actually facilitate people having visions of the other side. So we've got a great selection of exciting people. I think the one that really sparked a lot of attention, and I've chatted about quite a bit. You're going to find it in the back of the oh, I opened right on that page. That's a good omen. The chapter is called The Mystery School of Death. And because there's such a fascination with what is on the other side and accessing it, I decided to include a shaman who works with plant medicine. And because I really wanted to cement this story in Africa, I chose an African plant, and the African plant is called iboga, and it comes from Gabon, a Gabonian plant. It's an extract. It's very widely used actually to treat addiction. So I found a Bwiti shaman. Bwiti is the religion behind the use of the plant. And I interviewed him. So he's taken over 7,000 people through the plant medicine. And Bwiti is a religion, and it is also called the cult of the dead. So there we go for those of you who are interested in that. So it basically initiates people, and this is what he calls, he says to me, and this is a really hilarious chapter, actually, I have to be honest with you. He says to me that his job as a shaman is to initiate people into death. And many people have laughed because the beginning of the chapter, even though I've closed it now, but the beginning of the chapter is his sentence, and he says to me when I first meet him in his house where he's about to run it. It starts with the sentence, "It is possible when you are dead to stay there." And he speaks about his journey taking people through these plant medicine journeys through the valley of death, through the land of the living ghosts, they call it as well, and to bring them back. So this book and this journey to the other side has been the adventure of a lifetime. The personal adventure of a lifetime, not just my own experience with near death, but being in the company of others who have been on that journey themselves. And when I started chatting this evening, I spoke about what led up to my near-death experience, which was strange things. Still, to this day, the diagnosis of my own illness is influenza. I had the flu. So we don't know why. And many of these experiences of people who touched with death, they also don't know why. Some were accidents, some were shootings. What we do know is that near death doesn't give us all the answers. In fact, it gives us very few answers. I speak very jokingly in the book about speaking on a podcast when I was promoting Love and Above, and a podcast host started with the question, "So Sarah, what do you think happens when we die?" And I went on to speak about my own experience, what I'd seen on the other side, and for probably an hour chatting about it. And then when the podcast ended, he said, "Sarah, I just have one more question I want to ask you. What do you think happens when we die?" And that really, I think, is the heart of this book. And I think it's the heart of many books. It's the question of our time, and actually it's the question of all time. And the question is not just what happens when we die. It's not that. It's much bigger. It's really, is there anything else out there? What is out there? Is there anything else? And if there is, comes the second part of this question. If there is something else out there, can I connect with it before? And in my research of this book, in speaking to people who've had near-death experiences, the reason science has focused on these people is because they've just had that tiny glimpse over the garden fence into what lies thereafter, that little glimpse. But the truth is, and the real truth is that despite 35,000 years of Homo sapiens, despite religion and belief and searching and modalities and what we think and what we hold on to, the real truth is we actually still don't know. And what I found in this research is that what I really loved is that we have found so many ways to put a container around what it is to be human and what it may mean to connect to the divine. My one interview subject, Belinda Silbert, the rabbi, was born psychic. She was born with an incredible ability to connect to the other side from soul beings, spoke to them. They were just part of her world. She had a near-death experience at 21, and again at 28. She said to me, and I really loved this, she said, Sarah, the truth be told, I could have chosen anything. Could have chosen any of the bigger belief systems that are based in love. But her journey was with Kabbalah, with Jewish mysticism. And she said, it just gave me such a framework to be able to work within a container for faith. And also in this research I've done into death, near death, almost every single religion, every single faith out there does believe that there is something after death. The only faith that doesn't are atheists. And they believe that there's nothing. They believe in a concept of complete extermination, which is when life ends, it is like an electricity just being switched down and that there's nothing thereafter. But since humans, in fact, before even Homo sapiens, in fact, back in the, oh my goodness, the Neanderthal times, even then, bodies were buried with treasures for the afterlife, with this belief that this is not all that is out there, that they would awake to something else. And the more basic the religion, the more basic the concept of the afterlife. So they would be buried with a spear and maybe some food. Whereas if you look specifically at our Egyptian cultures and any of the cultures thereafter, the methods of burial sort of spoke to what was expected. And many of the earlier religions believed that this afterlife was very similar to life here, just a little bit nicer. You know, Valhalla was to be celebrated. And then of course the more complex the religion, the more complex the vision of the afterlife. Both the Muslim and the Jewish faiths believe in your 7 layers, the 7 aspects closer to divinity. So I really found that, and it reflected very clearly in people's mystical experiences. I found in records mystical experiences and near-death experiences from indigenous people. And what's really extraordinary is that they ticked all the boxes, because there's these boxes. Dr. Raymond Moody, who was one of the biggest scientists who started to study the near-death, came up with a checklist. And the checklist had very specific things to qualify that it had been a near-death experience. The first was a sensation of leaving the body, and sometimes seeing your death being declared, sometimes hearing it, sometimes just immediately leaving the body and being aware of leaving. One of the other things that qualifies a near-death experience is being greeted or the presence of divine energies, divinity. The third, and this is really interesting, and this is across all faiths, is this question of a council, a reckoning. Some call it the Book of Life, people call it the Akashic Records, some call it a council of elders, depending on the different faith. So almost all of these experiences recorded over decades have come, the person encountering death has come to a place where they are asked to account for their life. Not in an unpleasant way, but just what have you done with it? The next thing that many of them have is a barrier. And this is really important, particularly in the indigenous ones, a place beyond which you cannot travel. So very often there is, and you're going to see 2 of these stories in my book. 2 of my characters interviewed went to hell, but they don't go into hell. They are shown hell. They are shown heaven, people. They are shown a huge bridge. They are shown a different land, but very seldom do they enter. And then these near-death experiences often have the presence of loved ones, not always at all. And then another very common thing is the return, and that's essential, right? They come back. And the how people come back differ or vary. Some just wake up in their bodies, like Glenn Douglas, who was shot. I myself had to fight my way back. It was an epic battle to come back to life. And others are sent back. They're told very specifically, and particularly in a lot of indigenous afterlives, people are sent back with a mission or a message. And often in more primitive cultures, indigenous cultures, it could just be a medicine. Like, you take this medicine to the woman of the tribe. Your work is as a healer. So there's the sort of messages people are given. So those are kind of the tick boxes of near-death experience. And they really do work across all boards. Just they get more and more simple. So I saw some questions in the chat, or were there comments? Hello, Karen. I was saying, I'm so glad you guys, lots of Christian, but they do not believe in reincarnation. Correct, yeah, absolutely. In fact, many of them believe in the judgment. So Judgment Day, and I'm sure many of you may know more about it than I do. Certainly one of my interviewees, Mohammed Lape, is a Christian pastor. His nickname is Reverend Hulk, because he's such a bodybuilder. And he had a death experience, and he was the person who actually was taken with the devil and shown false preachers, and a terrifying experience. It took him 2 years of trauma to actually process what had happened to him in that time. It's a really interesting story. He's the second person who was Christian who was shown a very, very dark warning. The second was Helene Page, whose story you'll also find in there. So yeah, there's the resurrection. And of course, reincarnation in many of the cultures. So they can be very sophisticated. The more sophisticated can be belief systems of how we come back, how many times we come back, each time bringing us closer and closer to divinity. Of course, one of my most interesting interviews, and I'm going to start wrapping up now because I know we're hitting our time limit, actually was with the teacher of non-duality. People have said to me, Sarah, which of all the people you spoke to, well, cross faiths, and we've got Hindus, we've got, you name it, we've got Kabbalists, we've got Jews, we've got everybody. The one that for me was really resonant was the teacher of non-duality, Colleen Joy Page. She's quite a well-known spiritual teacher. And she asks the question, when people say, what is out there? What if it's not anywhere at all? What if it's not out there? Or it's somewhere? But what if it is everywhere and everything and nothing at the same time? And my experience and my personal near-death experience felt very resonant with that. I didn't see God. I didn't speak to angels. But what I was in the great mystery of creation, in which everything was interconnected and interwoven and an energetic mesh. My disappointment and my concern was that I hadn't had those things that people have seen. But in the 10 years, 12 years since it's happened, and in my sitting with what was there, not with what was not there, I've come to really been drawn to this strange belief that I have no name for it, and yet there is a divinity out there. And I begin the book with a quote from Taz Singh. She's a psychic medium, and she is incredible. And she starts with the sentence, there is something bigger than us out there, guys. There is something bigger than us out there. And I think so many of these stories, they've touched it, they've spoken to it, they've seen it. And they really are inspiring, and they make one feel that we are on a path that is so much bigger. So I'm looking at your questions. Can we say that what you experience depends on your beliefs? That's really a fantastic question. Thank you for that. Can we say that what you experience in near death is linked to your belief? Yes, you can. Absolutely. On a level. So for example, it would not be something completely weird that you hadn't heard of. So my experience with this afterlife, with this the great mystery of creation, the universe, Yahweh, whatever we want to call it, divinity, the divine God. I use the word God. was completely linked to my culture and my upbringing. And the fact that it was quite shamanic was potentially very linked to the fact that my husband had been in this path. Belinda Silbert, who works with past life regressions, etc., has said that we are presented with a vision that makes sense to us because divinity and intelligence, the divine intelligence, is so vast and incomprehensible. We are presented with something that makes sense to us. But at the very same time, you do find in near-death experiences that, for example, a Hindu may be presented with Jesus Christ. It is not actually particularly linked to your faith. What is presented to you, this divine being, this divine presence, if you're a Christian, don't necessarily expect to see God, Jesus, and those deities, for example. So it's not particularly linked. And the next thing that is just very clear is that science, and it's quite scientifically unpacked in the book, is that a near-death experience, those similar check boxes happen to everybody, including atheists. So you do not have to believe in anything. And if you have a near-death experience, you may be greeted by Mary, the Mother of Sorrows, or by God. And that's quite strange for people. So you don't have to believe in anything to have it, and who you see is not always linked to what you believe. And the thing I think it's really important to remember is that a near-death experience is an unwelcome, unwanted event. Unlike the rest of the book deals with people who may be on a searching journey. So when we go for plant medicine or go to psychics or do the breath work, or we're trying to touch divinity, it's by our design, but near-death experiences are very unwelcome and unwanted generally. All right. So are there any? So thank you all for joining me. I really did want to just unpack it a little bit. I hope this wasn't too short or too long. Are there any questions on the side? And are there any questions in general? I'm going to actually pause the recording now, and so we can just for a few minutes chat, and then I'm going to stop the recording.